You're nothing but a disappointment, Victoria. A complete failure who can't even hold down a real job." Those were the words my father, Richard Thornfield, spat across the Thanksgiving dinner table in front of 23 family members, his voice dripping with the same contempt he'd carried for me since I was 16. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in exactly 48 hours, his own boss would be sitting in my executive boardroom, calling me Madam Chairman, and asking for my approval on a merger that would determine whether my father kept his job or joined the unemployment line before Christmas. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Victoria Ashford, and if you're watching this, stay with me, because this is the story of how a father's cruelest moment became the catalyst for the most satisfying Thanksgiving weekend of my entire life. Have you ever sat at a family dinner and felt like you were the main course? That's exactly what happened at my Aunt Delilah's house in Millbrook Heights last Thursday. Picture this: the good china, the perfectly roasted turkey, the sound of football games echoing from the living room, and 23 pairs of eyes watching as my father systematically destroyed what little self-worth I had left in front of everyone I'd grown up with. It started innocently enough. My cousin Ethan was talking about his new promotion at some accounting firm downtown. My sister Penelope was showing off photos from her recent wedding in the Hamptons. And then the conversation turned to me. That dreaded question that haunts every family gathering: "So, Victoria, what are you up to these days?" I should have known better than to give an honest answer. I should have just smiled and said consulting or freelancing like I'd done at previous gatherings. But something in me, maybe it was the wine, maybe it was the exhaustion from traveling back to Millbrook Heights from my actual life in Riverside City, made me tell the truth. "I'm working in corporate strategy and development," I said simply, cutting into my sweet potatoes. That's when my father's eyes lit up with that familiar gleam of condescension. You know the look. The one that says, "Here we go again with Victoria's delusions of grandeur." "Corporate strategy," he repeated, his voice already taking on that mocking tone that had haunted my childhood. "Let me guess, you're calling yourself a consultant again? Victoria, when are you going to stop playing pretend and get a real job like your sister?" The table went quiet. Forks stopped moving. Even my 8-year-old nephew Timothy looked up from his mashed potatoes, sensing the shift in energy. But my father wasn't done. He never was. "Do you know what I told my boss, Harold Grayson, about you last week?" he continued, his voice getting louder and more theatrical with each word. "I told him I have 2 daughters, one who married a surgeon and lives in a beautiful home in Westchester, and another who's 32 years old and still pretending to be important while living in some studio apartment, playing with PowerPoint presentations." My mother, Catherine, tried to intervene with a weak, "Richard, that's enough." But he was on a roll now. This was his moment to shine, to remind everyone at the table why he was the successful one, the important one, the one whose opinion mattered. "You want to know what real corporate strategy looks like, Victoria?" He pulled out his phone and started showing photos to the table. "This is Harold Grayson's office. Corner suite, 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower downtown. He's the Regional Vice President of Operations for Blackstone Industries. That's what success looks like. Not whatever fantasy you're living in Riverside City." The humiliation was suffocating. I could feel my face burning as he continued his performance, gesturing wildly with his wine glass, completely oblivious to the fact that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his entire career. Harold was asking me about my family at the company retreat last month, and you know what I had to tell him? I had to admit that my youngest daughter is a failure. A 32-year-old failure, who can't even afford to visit home more than twice a year because she's too busy pretending to be some big-shot executive. My Aunt Delilah tried to change the subject, asking about dessert, but my father held up his hand. He wasn't finished destroying me yet. "You know what your problem is, Victoria? You've always lived in a fantasy world. Even as a kid, you thought you were smarter than everyone else, thought you deserved more than you were willing to work for. Well, reality check. You're 32, single, living paycheck to paycheck, and calling yourself a corporate strategist. That's not success, sweetheart. That's delusion. The silence that followed was deafening. 23 people staring at their plates, uncomfortable with the cruelty they'd just witnessed, but too polite to call him out. My sister Penelope looked like she wanted to disappear. My mother was frantically rearranging the centerpiece. Even my usually loud Uncle Benjamin had nothing to say. I set down my fork, looked directly at my father, and said the only words I could manage, "You're absolutely right, Dad. I should probably head back to Riverside City tomorrow and face reality." But here's what my father didn't know. Here's what none of them knew as they sat there in that uncomfortable silence, probably feeling sorry for poor, delusional Victoria. In exactly 48 hours, I would be sitting in the chairman's seat of the Meridian Tower's 45th floor boardroom, 3 floors above Harold Grayson's office, reviewing the quarterly performance reports of every regional vice president in the company, including his boss, including the man whose job security depended entirely on my signature on a restructuring proposal that would determine the fate of over 300 employees across 4 states. My father had no idea that his failure daughter was about to become his boss's boss's boss. And Monday morning, when Harold Grayson walked into that boardroom to present his division's performance metrics to the board of directors, he was going to discover that the woman his employee had spent Thanksgiving calling a disappointment was actually the youngest chairman in Blackstone Industries' 70-year history. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to how this all started, because the story of how I went from family failure to corporate chairman isn't just about business success. It's about the moment I stopped caring about my father's approval and started building something he could never understand or take credit for. Because sometimes the people who hurt you the most have no idea who you really are. And sometimes that's exactly the advantage you need. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Let me tell you who I really am, because understanding my journey is crucial to appreciating just how spectacularly wrong my father was that Thanksgiving evening. My name is Victoria Elena Ashford, and I'm 32 years old. I graduated summa cum laude from Westfield University with a double major in economics and international business, then earned my MBA from the prestigious Riverside Business Institute with a concentration in corporate strategy and mergers and acquisitions. But those credentials, impressive as they might sound, barely scratch the surface of who I've become. You see, while my father was busy telling his boss, Harold Grayson, that I was a failure, I was actually living a life that most business executives could only dream of. Every morning, I wake up in my corner penthouse in Riverside City's financial district. Not the studio apartment my father imagined, but a 3,000-square-foot space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. The monthly rent alone is more than most people's annual salary, but when you're pulling in the kind of income I've been making for the past 3 years, luxury becomes a necessity rather than an indulgence. But this story isn't about money or material success. It's about something much deeper, the profound disconnect between who your family thinks you are and who you've actually become when they're not paying attention. I've been living what most people would consider a double life, though that makes it sound more mysterious than it actually is. The truth is simpler and more painful. I stopped trying to explain my real life to my family about 5 years ago, because they simply couldn't or wouldn't understand it. When I told them I was working in corporate strategy, I wasn't lying, I just wasn't telling them the whole truth. See, most people hear corporate strategy and think consultant, analyst, maybe middle management if they're being generous. What they don't realize is that in today's business world, the people who understand strategy at the highest level aren't just advisors. They're the ones making the decisions that shape entire industries. 3 years ago, I was recruited by Blackstone Industries to lead their strategic transformation initiative. It sounds like corporate jargon, I know, but what it actually meant was this. I was brought in to identify struggling divisions, restructure failing departments, and either save them or recommend their closure. In simpler terms, I became the person who decided which parts of the company lived and which parts died. The position came with a base salary that would make my father's head spin, plus performance bonuses that had turned me into what most people would consider wealthy by any reasonable standard. But more importantly, it came with something I'd never had before: real power. The kind of power that lets you walk into a boardroom full of men in their 50s and 60s and watch them hang on your every word because they know you hold their futures in your hands. Within 18 months, my recommendations had saved Blackstone Industries over $200 million in operational costs and increased their market efficiency by 34%. The board of directors didn't just notice. They promoted me to Senior Vice President of Strategic Operations, making me the youngest person ever to hold that position in the company's history. But even that wasn't the end of the story. Last year, when Chairman Edmund Fairchild announced his early retirement due to health issues, the board found themselves in an unprecedented situation. They needed someone who understood the company from the ground up, someone who had proven they could make the tough decisions that would keep Blackstone competitive in an increasingly volatile market. They chose me? At 31 years old, I became the youngest chairman in Blackstone Industries' 70-year history. Not the youngest female chairman, the youngest chairman, period. The announcement made the business pages of every major newspaper from Riverside City to New York. Forbes ran a profile calling me the strategic savant. The Wall Street Journal wrote an entire feature about how I was revolutionizing corporate governance for the next generation. And through all of this, the promotions, the press coverage, the industry recognition, my family remained blissfully unaware that their failure daughter was quietly becoming one of the most influential people in the regional business community. You might ask why I never told them, why I let them continue believing I was struggling when I could have easily proven otherwise. The answer is complicated and probably says as much about me as it does about them. Part of it was protection. I'd learned early in my career that success often breeds resentment, especially in families where achievement becomes a competition rather than a celebration. My sister Penelope had always been the successful one, the one who followed the traditional path of marriage and suburban life that my parents understood and approved of. I didn't want to disrupt that dynamic or create tension where none had existed before. But if I'm being completely honest, there was another reason too. I wanted to see how they would treat me when they thought I had nothing to offer them. When they believed I was just ordinary Victoria, struggling to make ends meet, with no impressive title or financial success to demand their respect. And what I discovered was both heartbreaking and liberating. They treated me exactly the way they always had, with condescension, dismissal, and the kind of casual cruelty that families inflict on the members they've decided don't matter. That Thanksgiving dinner wasn't an aberration. It was simply the most public display of an attitude my father had carried toward me for years. The only difference was that this time, he'd made his feelings clear in front of an audience that included my aunt, my cousins, and most importantly, his own professional reputation. Because here's what my father didn't realize, as he sat there smugly telling everyone about his boss, Harold Grayson, and the impressive corner office on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower. I wasn't just familiar with that building. I practically lived there. My office was on the 45th floor, and Harold Grayson reported to people who reported to me. In less than 48 hours, I would be sitting across from Harold in our Monday morning executive briefing, listening to him present his division's quarterly performance metrics, and trying not to think about the fact that this mild-mannered VP had spent his weekend hearing about what a disappointment his employee's daughter had turned out to be. But I knew something that would make the next few days very, very interesting. Harold Grayson had no idea that Richard Thornfield's failure daughter was about to determine whether his department survived the upcoming restructuring initiative that the board had scheduled for December. The irony was so perfect, it almost felt scripted. The drive back to my hotel that night was unlike any I'd ever experienced, not because of the route. I'd made the 40-minute journey from Millbrook Heights to downtown Riverside City countless times over the years. But because something fundamental had shifted inside me during those excruciating 20 minutes at my Aunt Delilah's dinner table, I'd driven to Thanksgiving dinner as Victoria Ashford, the dutiful daughter who still harbored some naive hope that maybe this year would be different. Maybe this year my father would ask about my life with genuine interest instead of predetermined judgment. Maybe this year I'd finally find the courage to tell him the truth about who I'd become. But I was driving back as someone entirely different. Someone who had finally, definitively, stopped caring about Richard Thornfield's approval. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was more like a door quietly closing inside my chest. The door I'd kept propped open for 32 years, waiting for my father to walk through it and see me as something other than a disappointment. That door was now locked, and I was the only one with the key. I pulled into the parking garage of the Grandview Hotel, where I always stayed when visiting Millbrook Heights, and sat in my car for what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes. The silence was deafening after the chaos of dinner, and for the first time all evening, I could actually think clearly. My phone had been buzzing intermittently during the drive, text messages from my sister Penelope, probably trying to apologize for Dad's behavior or smooth things over like she always did. I didn't read them. I wasn't ready for the family damage control routine that typically followed one of my father's public humiliation sessions. Instead, I found myself thinking about Monday morning, about the quarterly board meeting where Harold Grayson would be presenting his division's performance metrics, about the restructuring recommendations I'd been reviewing for the past 3 weeks, about the irony that my father's boss was probably going to spend the weekend telling his wife about the lovely Thanksgiving dinner he'd missed, while having no idea that his job security depended on the approval of the woman his employee had just called a failure. But here's what surprised me. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I wasn't plotting some elaborate scheme to humiliate my father or destroy Harold Grayson's career out of spite. Instead, I was feeling something I'd never experienced before: complete and total indifference to my father's opinion of me. For 32 years, every major decision I'd made had been filtered through the question of whether it would finally earn Richard Thornfield's respect. When I chose my college major, I picked economics partly because I thought he'd be impressed by the analytical rigor. When I pursued my MBA, I selected the most prestigious program I could get into, hoping he'd notice the achievement. When I took the job at Blackstone Industries, part of me was already imagining the moment I'd casually mention working for one of the region's largest corporations. But sitting in that parking garage, I realized that none of it had ever been about him. My success hadn't happened because I was trying to prove him wrong. It had happened in spite of his constant attempts to convince me I wasn't capable of it. The relief was overwhelming. 32 years of carrying the weight of his disapproval, and suddenly I could feel it lifting off my shoulders like fog burning away in sunlight. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was just done. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the missed messages from Penelope. "Vicky, I'm so sorry about Dad tonight. You know how he gets when he's had wine. Please don't let his words get to you. He doesn't understand what you do. Call me when you get back to your hotel. We need to talk." I typed back a single message. "I'm fine, Penny, really, don't worry about me." And I meant it. Not the fake fine you say when you're hurt and want someone to dig deeper. Not the defensive fine you use when you're trying to end an uncomfortable conversation. This was the genuine, peaceful kind of fine that comes when you finally stop fighting a battle you never needed to win. I deleted the other messages without reading them and walked into the hotel lobby. The Grandview was one of those old, elegant establishments that Riverside City was famous for: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted. The night manager, Thomas, recognized me immediately. "Good evening, Ms. Ashford. How was your family dinner?" I paused at the elevator, considering how to answer that question. How do you explain that your family dinner was simultaneously the worst and most liberating experience you've had in years? "Educational," I said finally, and he smiled politely without asking for clarification. In my room, I poured myself a glass of wine from the bottle I'd brought back from my last business trip to Paris, a vintage that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month, and sat by the window overlooking the city. The lights of Riverside City stretched out below me, including the distinctive glow of the Meridian Tower where I'd be spending most of Monday morning. My laptop was sitting on the desk, and for a moment I considered opening it and reviewing the quarterly reports I'd be discussing in tomorrow's executive briefing. Harold Grayson's division had been underperforming for 2 consecutive quarters, and there were some serious questions about whether his leadership style was still effective in the current market environment. But I didn't want to think about work. Not tonight. Tonight was about something much more personal and infinitely more important. The moment I stopped being Richard Thornfield's daughter and became fully, completely, unapologetically myself. I thought about all the times I'd bitten my tongue when he made dismissive comments about my career choices. All the times I'd minimized my achievements to avoid making him feel threatened or inadequate. All the energy I'd wasted trying to translate my success into terms he could understand and approve of. What a colossal waste of time that had been. The truth was, I didn't need his understanding or approval anymore. I hadn't needed it for years, but I'd been too afraid to admit it. I had been clinging to some childhood fantasy that someday he would look at me with pride instead of disappointment. That someday he would ask about my work because he was genuinely interested, rather than looking for ammunition to criticize me with. But that someday wasn't coming, and for the first time in my adult life I was genuinely okay with that. I raised my wine glass to the window, to the city lights, to the life I'd built despite every message my father had ever sent me about my worth and potential. "Here's to not needing your permission anymore, Dad," I said aloud to the empty room. The words felt like a weight lifting off my chest. Tomorrow, I would drive back to my penthouse and prepare for a Monday that would be unlike any other in my professional career. Not because I was planning to use my position for revenge, but because I would be walking into that boardroom as someone who had finally, completely, stopped carrying her father's voice in her head. Monday morning was going to be very interesting indeed, but tonight, for the first time in years, I was sleeping like someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone except herself. The transformation was complete. The dutiful daughter who had walked into Thanksgiving dinner was gone, and in her place was a woman who knew exactly who she was and exactly what she was worth, regardless of what anyone else thought about it. To understand why that Thanksgiving dinner felt like such a breaking point, you need to understand that my father's cruelty wasn't an anomaly. It was a carefully established pattern that had been decades in the making. Let me take you back to when it all started. I was 7 years old, sitting at our kitchen table in our modest 2-bedroom house on Elmwood Street, struggling with a math worksheet that seemed impossible. Penelope, who was 10 at the time, had always been naturally gifted with numbers, finishing her homework in minutes while I agonized over each problem. "Daddy, can you help me with this one?" I asked, pointing to a word problem about trains and distances that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. My father looked over from his newspaper, glanced at the worksheet, and sighed with the kind of exasperation usually reserved for much more serious inconveniences. "Victoria, if you can't figure out basic multiplication by now, maybe you're just not cut out for advanced thinking. Some people are smart like your sister, and some people—" He shrugged, leaving the sentence hanging in the air like a judgment I was supposed to accept as fact. I was 7 years old, and I believed him. That became the template for our relationship. Penelope was the smart one, the capable one, the one who would amount to something. I was the one who needed to lower my expectations and find a more realistic path through life. When I was 12 and brought home a report card with straight A's except for 1 B+ in physical education, his response wasn't congratulations. It was, "What happened in gym class? If you're going to do something, Victoria, you should do it right or not at all." When I was 15 and won 2nd place in the regional debate championship, beating out students from schools with much better funding and resources, he asked why I hadn't come in first. "2nd place is just the first loser," he said, not even looking up from his dinner. "Maybe debate isn't really your strength." But the pattern went deeper than just academic dismissal. It was woven into every aspect of how he saw me and my potential in the world. When I was 16 and got my first job at Morrison's ice cream parlor downtown, working after school and weekends to save money for college applications, he criticized my work ethic. "You're always tired when you come home. If you can't handle scooping ice cream, how do you expect to manage anything more challenging?" Never mind that I was working 20 hours a week while maintaining a 3.8 GPA and participating in 3 extracurricular activities. Never mind that I was the only one of my friends who was completely self-sufficient for spending money in college savings. In his eyes, the fact that I was tired after working was evidence of weakness, not dedication. The college application process was particularly brutal. I had my heart set on Westfield University, which had an excellent business program and a reputation for producing successful graduates. The tuition was expensive, but I'd researched scholarship opportunities extensively and felt confident I could make it work financially. "Victoria, you need to be realistic about your options," he said when I showed him the application materials. "Westfield is for students who are exceptional. You're a solid B+ student from a public high school. You should be looking at community colleges or maybe the state school if you're lucky." I applied to Westfield anyway, using money I'd saved from my ice cream parlor job to pay the application fees. When my acceptance letter arrived along with a partial academic scholarship, I was ecstatic. I ran into the kitchen waving the letter, expecting, maybe for the first time in my life, to see pride in my father's eyes. Instead, he read the letter with a frown. "This scholarship only covers 60% of tuition. How are you planning to pay for the rest? You think money grows on trees?" "I'll work during school and take out student loans for what the scholarship doesn't cover," I explained, the excitement already draining from my voice. "Lots of students do it." "Student loans you'll be paying off for decades," he replied dismissively. "Victoria, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You don't think things through. You get caught up in these grandiose ideas without considering the practical realities." But I went anyway. I worked 2 part-time jobs throughout college, took out loans, applied for every additional scholarship I could find, and graduated summa cum laude with a double major in economics and international business. The day I walked across that stage, I looked out into the audience and saw my father checking his phone. When I decided to pursue my MBA, the pattern repeated itself with almost identical conversations. "More school, Victoria? At some point, you need to stop hiding in classrooms and join the real world. The real world needs people with advanced business training, Dad. The market is competitive. The market doesn't care about fancy degrees if you don't have practical experience. You're 25 years old and you've never had a real job." Never mind that I'd worked continuously throughout college and had completed 3 high-level internships. Never mind that I'd been offered a position at a respected consulting firm that would start immediately after graduation. In his narrative, I was perpetually naive, impractical, and destined for disappointment. When I landed the consulting position at Meridian Strategic Solutions right out of graduate school, making more money than he'd ever earned in his life, his response was predictable. "Consulting is just a fancy word for temporary work, Victoria. Don't get too comfortable. Those positions never last." The position lasted 2 years and led directly to my recruitment by Blackstone Industries. When I bought my first car, a modest but reliable sedan that I'd saved for months to purchase outright, he criticized the choice. "You paid too much. You should have bought used. This is why you'll never get ahead financially." When I moved out of my shared apartment into a nice 1-bedroom place in a better neighborhood, he toured it with the air of someone inspecting a crime scene. "The rent here must be astronomical. You're living beyond your means, Victoria. This kind of lifestyle is unsustainable." Each achievement, each milestone, each step forward in my career was met with skepticism, criticism, or predictions of imminent failure. And the insidious thing about this pattern was how it had shaped my own internal voice over the years. Even as I was succeeding professionally, even as I was earning recognition and promotions and financial stability, part of me was always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Part of me had internalized his constant message that I was reaching beyond my capabilities, that my success was somehow fraudulent or temporary. When I was promoted to senior vice president at Blackstone, I spent weeks waiting for them to realize they'd made a mistake. When I was offered the chairman position, my first thought wasn't celebration. It was anxiety about whether I was truly qualified for such responsibility. That's what 30 years of psychological conditioning can do to a person. Even when external evidence proves the narrative wrong, the internal voice continues repeating the familiar refrains. You're not that smart. You're not that capable. You're reaching too high. You're going to fail eventually. But here's what I'd finally realized. Sitting in that hotel room after Thanksgiving dinner, the voice in my head criticizing my achievements wasn't my voice. It was his. And I'd been carrying it around like an unwelcome passenger for decades, letting it influence my decisions and limit my confidence even as I was proving it wrong over and over again. The Thanksgiving dinner wasn't just another example of his pattern. It was the moment when I finally recognized the pattern for what it was. Not truth, not wisdom, not protective concern, just a man so threatened by his daughter's success that he needed to tear it down to preserve his own sense of superiority. And once you see a pattern that clearly you can't unsee it, more importantly, you can choose to stop participating in it. What made this particular Thanksgiving different from all the others wasn't just the public humiliation, though that was certainly painful enough. It was the timing, the context, and the cruel irony of everything that had happened in the weeks leading up to that dinner. You see, the month before Thanksgiving had been the most professionally significant period of my entire career. It was the month when everything I'd worked toward for over a decade finally crystallized into something that even my harshest critics couldn't dismiss or diminish. 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, I'd been sitting in the boardroom of Blackstone Industries headquarters, facing the most challenging decision of my tenure as chairman. The company was at a crossroads that would determine not just our financial future, but the livelihoods of thousands of employees across 6 states. Our biggest competitor, Titanium Corp., had made an aggressive acquisition offer that would essentially dissolve Blackstone Industries as an independent entity. The offer was substantial, $2.8 billion, and several board members were pushing hard for acceptance. It would mean immediate profits for shareholders and golden parachutes for executives, but it would also mean massive layoffs and the end of 70 years of independent operation. I'd spent countless hours analyzing market projections, consulting with industry experts, and developing an alternative strategy that could keep us competitive without surrendering our autonomy. It was risky, innovative, and required the kind of long-term thinking that many corporations had abandoned in favor of quarterly profit maximization. My proposal involved restructuring our operational divisions, investing heavily in emerging market technologies, and forming strategic partnerships with 3 smaller companies that complemented our core competencies. It was complex, ambitious, and would require every department to perform at peak efficiency for the plan to succeed. The board vote was scheduled for the Monday after Thanksgiving. 2 weeks before the holiday, Forbes published a cover story titled "The Visionary CEO: How Victoria Ashford is Revolutionizing Corporate Strategy." The article detailed my restructuring plan and called it the most innovative approach to competitive positioning we've seen in the industry in over a decade. 1 week before Thanksgiving, the Wall Street Journal ran an editorial praising my leadership during the acquisition crisis, noting that, quote, Ashford's refusal to take the easy buyout demonstrates the kind of principled decision-making that builds lasting corporate legacies. 3 days before Thanksgiving, Harvard Business Review published a case study on my strategic methodology, which would be taught in MBA programs starting the following semester. I was being recognized as one of the most influential business leaders in the region. Industry analysts were calling my restructuring plan revolutionary. Business schools were studying my decision-making process. And my phone was ringing constantly with interview requests from major publications. But here's the thing about professional success at that level. It can be incredibly isolating. When you're making decisions that affect thousands of people and millions of dollars, there aren't many people you can talk to about the pressure, the uncertainty, or the weight of responsibility you're carrying. I found myself wanting to share this success with someone who would understand its significance. Someone who would appreciate not just the recognition, but the years of preparation and strategic thinking that had led to this moment. Someone who would be proud of how far I'd come from that 7-year-old struggling with math homework. So I made a decision that, in retrospect, seems almost naively optimistic. I decided to tell my family the truth about my career during Thanksgiving dinner. I spent hours planning how to share the news. I brought copies of the Forbes article and the Wall Street Journal editorial. I had prepared a simple, humble way to explain my position at Blackstone Industries without sounding boastful or condescending. I was genuinely excited about the possibility of finally being honest with them about who I'd become. The irony is almost too painful to recount. I drove to Millbrook Heights that Thursday carrying physical evidence of professional recognition that most people only dream of achieving. In my purse were magazine articles with my photograph on the cover, editorial praise from the most respected business publications in the country, and documentation of a career that had exceeded every goal I'd set for myself. And I walked into that dinner actually hoping, that maybe this would be the moment my father would finally see me as something other than a disappointment. Instead, I got the most brutal public humiliation of my adult life. But the real catalyst, the moment that transformed embarrassment into something much more powerful, came about an hour after I'd left the dinner. I was sitting in my hotel room, still processing what had happened, when my phone rang. It was Amanda Fitzgerald, the senior editor at Business Weekly, who had been trying to schedule an interview with me for their year-end Power Players issue. "Victoria, I hope I'm not calling too late," she said. "I know it's Thanksgiving evening, but I wanted to confirm our interview slot for next week. The article is going to be the centerpiece of our December issue, and we're particularly excited to discuss your handling of the Titanium Corp situation." As she spoke, I could hear my father's voice echoing in my head. "You're nothing but a disappointment, Victoria, a complete failure who can't even hold down a real job." The disconnect was so jarring it almost felt surreal. Here was one of the most respected business journalists in the country calling me on Thanksgiving evening to discuss featuring my leadership strategies in a national publication, while my father's words about my being a failure were still ringing in my ears. "Amanda," I said, "can I ask you something? In your professional opinion, what does success actually look like in today's business environment?" She paused, probably surprised by the philosophical nature of the question. "Well, I'd say it's exactly what you've demonstrated this year. The courage to make difficult decisions under pressure, the vision to see long-term opportunities that others miss, and the leadership skills to guide an organization through major transitions. Why do you ask?" I laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound, just curious about external perspectives on achievement. After we hung up, I sat there contemplating the absurdity of the situation. In the span of a single evening, I'd been called a failure by the man whose approval I'd spent 32 years trying to earn, and then contacted by a national business publication that wanted to feature my success story as an example for other executives to follow. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about one terrible dinner or one moment of public humiliation. This was about a fundamental incompatibility between who I actually was and who my family needed me to be for their own psychological comfort. My father didn't call me a failure because I was failing. He called me a failure because my success threatened his narrative about himself and his place in the world. Acknowledging my achievements would mean acknowledging that he'd been wrong about me for 30 years, and that level of self-reflection was apparently beyond his capabilities. The cruelest part wasn't even the words themselves, it was the timing. I had driven to that dinner carrying evidence of professional recognition that would validate anyone's career accomplishments, ready to finally share my real life with the people who claimed to love me. Instead, I received the most vicious character assassination my father had ever delivered. But here's what he didn't realize. By choosing that particular moment to tear me down, he had inadvertently freed me from ever needing his validation again. Because when someone calls you a failure during the most successful period of your professional life, it becomes impossible to take their judgment seriously anymore. The contrast was so stark, so ridiculous that it shattered whatever remaining power his opinion held over me. I finally understood that his criticism wasn't based on reality. It was based on his own insecurities and limitations. And that realization changed everything about how I would approach the next phase of my life, starting with Monday morning's board meeting, where his boss would discover exactly who Richard Thornfield's failure daughter really was. Saturday morning brought an unexpected phone call that would transform my weekend from a period of reflection into something far more interesting. I was sitting in the hotel restaurant, picking at a bowl of oatmeal and scrolling through industry news on my tablet, when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't immediately recognize. "Ms. Ashford? This is Janet Williamson from the Riverside City Business Journal. I'm terribly sorry to bother you on a holiday weekend, but we're running a feature story on Monday about the most influential business leaders in the region, and we'd love to include a quote from you about your recent strategic initiatives at Blackstone Industries." I agreed to the brief interview, and as we talked, she mentioned something that made me pause mid-sentence. "We're also featuring several other executives from major companies in the area. One of them is Harold Grayson from Blackstone's Regional Operations Division. He spoke very highly of the company's new direction under your leadership, though he seemed a bit nervous about the upcoming restructuring evaluations." After I hung up, I sat there staring at my coffee cup, processing what she'd just told me. Harold Grayson was nervous about restructuring evaluations. Of course he was, because his division had been underperforming significantly, and Monday's board meeting would include a comprehensive review of every regional operation. But that wasn't what made my heart rate spike. It was the sudden realization of a connection I'd somehow missed until that moment. Harold Grayson, Regional Vice President of Operations. The man my father had spent Thanksgiving dinner praising as the epitome of corporate success. The man whose corner office on the 42nd floor supposedly represented everything I'd failed to achieve. I pulled out my laptop and opened the confidential files I'd been reviewing for Monday's meeting. There it was, Harold Grayson's division performance report, and it painted a picture that was far less impressive than my father's glowing description. Grayson's region had missed their quarterly targets by 18% in Q2 and 23% in Q3. Customer satisfaction scores had dropped 15% under his leadership. Employee turnover in his division was running at 34%, nearly double the company average. 3 major clients had terminated their contracts, citing, quote, "inadequate service delivery and poor communication protocols." As chairman, I'd been reviewing these numbers for weeks as part of our comprehensive restructuring initiative. Grayson's division was one of several that would need significant leadership changes if we wanted to avoid the Titanium Corp buyout and maintain our competitive position. But here's what made the situation particularly fascinating. Harold Grayson had no idea who I was outside of the boardroom context. To him, I was Victoria Ashford, chairman of Blackstone Industries. He had no way of knowing that I was also Victoria Thornfield, the daughter his employee had spent Thanksgiving calling a failure. I called my assistant, Rebecca, even though it was Saturday morning. "Rebecca, I need you to pull Harold Grayson's complete employment file for Monday's meeting. Also, I want a detailed breakdown of his division's client retention rates for the past 18 months. "Of course, Ms. Ashford. Is there anything specific you're looking for?" "Just being thorough," I said, though the truth was far more complex. After hanging up, I found myself thinking about the layers of irony embedded in this situation. My father worked as a mid-level operations coordinator in Harold Grayson's division. His job security depended entirely on Grayson's continued employment with the company. And Grayson's continued employment depended on Monday's restructuring evaluation, an evaluation that would be conducted by the woman Grayson's employee had publicly humiliated just 2 days earlier. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about irony or cosmic justice. This was about something much more profound. The complete disconnect between perception and reality in my father's understanding of success and power. He had held up Harold Grayson as an example of everything I wasn't: successful, important, worthy of respect. But the reality was that Grayson was struggling to maintain his position in a company where I held the ultimate authority over his professional future. My father had bragged about Grayson's corner office on the 42nd floor, apparently unaware that his daughter worked 3 floors above that, in an executive suite that Grayson himself had never been invited to enter. He had described Grayson as someone who understood real corporate strategy, while completely dismissing his own daughter's work in strategic planning, work that would literally determine whether Grayson kept his job or joined the ranks of executives we'd be letting go as part of the restructuring. The power dynamic was so completely reversed from my father's perception that it almost felt like fiction. But then I remembered something else from Thursday's dinner, something that had been buried under the humiliation and anger, but now seemed critically important. My father hadn't just praised Harold Grayson in general terms. He had specifically mentioned that Grayson had been asking about his family at a recent company retreat. That meant Grayson knew Richard Thornfield had daughters. He might even know their names. I opened my laptop again and searched through the company directory. There it was. Richard Thornfield, Operations Coordinator, Regional Division, reporting directly to Harold Grayson's department. A plan began forming in my mind, not a malicious plan, but something far more elegant. Something that would resolve the Harold Grayson performance issues while simultaneously providing a very educational experience for my father. You see, Monday's board meeting wasn't just about reviewing quarterly performance reports. We were also implementing a new policy I'd developed called 360-degree leadership evaluation, where division heads would be assessed not just on financial metrics, but on their knowledge of and engagement with their entire team structure. Part of this evaluation involved randomly selecting employees from each division to provide anonymous feedback about their leadership experience. It was designed to identify disconnects between management perception and employee reality, exactly the kind of comprehensive assessment that could reveal whether someone like Harold Grayson truly understood the people he was supposed to be leading. I made a note to ensure that Richard Thornfield would be among the employees selected for anonymous feedback about his division's leadership effectiveness. Not because I wanted to manipulate the outcome, but because I was genuinely curious about whether Harold Grayson had any idea what kind of person he'd been praising to my father. Did Grayson know that his enthusiastic employee had spent Thanksgiving calling his own daughter a failure? Did he realize that his operation coordinator was working for a company chaired by the woman he'd been dismissing as unsuccessful? More importantly, did Grayson understand that his division's poor performance and his apparent disconnect from his employees' personal situations were exactly the kind of leadership blind spots that our restructuring initiative was designed to address? The beauty of the situation was that I wouldn't need to do anything vindictive or unprofessional to create a learning experience for everyone involved. I would simply need to do my job thoroughly and let the natural consequences of poor performance and inadequate leadership speak for themselves. Harold Grayson would come into Monday's meeting expecting a routine quarterly review. Instead, he would discover that his division was under comprehensive evaluation by someone who had very specific insights into his management effectiveness and employee relations. My father would continue working for a company where his failure daughter held the ultimate decision-making authority, blissfully unaware that every policy change, every strategic initiative, and every restructuring decision flowed from an office 3 floors above his boss's supposedly impressive corner suite. And I would finally have the opportunity to demonstrate the difference between actual corporate power and the kind of superficial status markers that had so impressed my father at Thanksgiving dinner. Monday morning couldn't come soon enough. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November air that demanded focus and clarity. I checked out of the Grandview Hotel early and drove back to my penthouse in Riverside City's financial district, my mind already shifting into the strategic planning mode that had served me well throughout my career. But this wasn't just another business challenge requiring careful preparation. This was something far more personal and infinitely more delicate, a situation where professional responsibility and family dynamics would intersect in ways that could either create profound justice or spectacular disaster. The first thing I did when I reached my apartment was pour myself a strong cup of coffee and spread out all the relevant documents across my dining room table. Harold Grayson's performance files, the restructuring evaluation criteria, employee feedback protocols, and the detailed agenda for Monday's board meeting. I needed to understand every variable, every potential outcome, and every ethical boundary that would guide my decisions over the next 48 hours. The restructuring evaluation wasn't something I designed with my father or Harold Grayson in mind. It was a comprehensive business strategy I'd been developing for months to address systemic performance issues across multiple divisions. But the timing and circumstances had created an opportunity for a masterclass in corporate accountability that would benefit everyone involved, whether they realized it or not. I called Rebecca again, this time with specific instructions that would ensure Monday's evaluation process was both thorough and completely above board. Rebecca, I need you to prepare the complete 360-degree evaluation package for Harold Grayson's division. I want employee feedback forms sent to a random sampling of his team members, but make sure the selection process is documented and auditable. This needs to be completely transparent. Of course, Ms. Ashford. Should I use the standard random selection algorithm? Exactly. And Rebecca, I want the evaluation criteria to focus specifically on leadership communication, team engagement, and strategic vision. Those are the areas where our underperforming divisions have shown the most significant weaknesses. I'll have everything prepared for tomorrow morning's meeting. After hanging up, I spent the next several hours reviewing industry best practices for corporate restructuring. I wasn't just preparing for a single meeting. I was preparing for a process that would likely reshape Blackstone Industries' entire operational structure over the coming months. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't also thinking about the very personal dimensions of what was about to unfold. My father had spent 32 years positioning himself as the voice of practical wisdom in our family, the one who understood how the real world worked, who could accurately assess success and failure, who had the experience to judge whether someone was living up to their potential. Monday morning would test the accuracy of those assessments in ways he couldn't possibly anticipate. I opened my laptop and began drafting a series of questions that would form the foundation of Harold Grayson's evaluation. These weren't gotcha questions or traps. They were legitimate inquiries that any competent executive should be able to answer about their division's performance and strategic direction. Describe your approach to employee engagement and retention in a competitive market environment. How do you measure and address performance gaps within your team structure? What strategies have you implemented to improve client satisfaction and retention rates? How do you stay connected with individual team members and their professional development needs? Each question was designed to reveal whether Grayson possessed the kind of comprehensive leadership understanding that his position required. More importantly, they would reveal whether he had the self-awareness to recognize his division's challenges and the strategic thinking to address them effectively. As I worked, I found myself thinking about the broader implications of what I was orchestrating. This wasn't just about proving my father wrong or demonstrating my own success. This was about creating a moment of clarity that might finally bridge the gap between perception and reality in our relationship. For 32 years, my father had operated under the assumption that he understood business success better than I did. He had consistently dismissed my achievements while elevating people like Harold Grayson as examples of what real accomplishment looked like. But what if Harold Grayson's corner office and impressive title were just surface indicators that masked deeper performance issues? What if my father's assessment of success was based on outdated metrics that didn't reflect actual leadership effectiveness or strategic competence? Monday's evaluation would provide answers to those questions in the most objective way possible through documented performance data, employee feedback, and strategic analysis that removed personal bias from the equation. I spent the afternoon reviewing Harold Grayson's employment history more thoroughly. He'd been with Blackstone Industries for 12 years, working his way up through various operational roles before being promoted to regional vice president 3 years ago. His early performance reviews were solid but unremarkable, the kind of steady, competent work that keeps organizations functioning without driving innovation or exceptional results. But his recent evaluations told a different story. Client complaints had increased steadily over the past 18 months. His division's profit margins had declined in 4 of the last 6 quarters. Most tellingly, employee satisfaction surveys showed significant concerns about communication, strategic direction, and professional development opportunities. These weren't the metrics of someone who deserved the kind of praise my father had heaped on him at Thanksgiving dinner. They were the metrics of someone who had likely been promoted beyond his optimal level of competence, a common phenomenon in organizations that prioritize tenure over performance. As evening approached, I realized I needed to prepare myself psychologically for what Monday might bring. This wasn't just a business meeting anymore. It was potentially the moment when my father would discover that his understanding of success, power, and achievement had been fundamentally flawed for decades. I called my mentor, Dr. Patricia Holloway, who had been my strategic thinking professor during graduate school and had become a trusted advisor throughout my career. Patricia, I have a situation that's both professional and personal, and I need some guidance on maintaining appropriate boundaries. I explained the circumstances without revealing specific names or company details, focusing on the ethical considerations of evaluating an employee whose family member had personal conflicts with my own family. Victoria, she said after I'd finished, the key is ensuring that your professional decisions are based entirely on documented performance data and legitimate business needs. If you can honestly say that your evaluation process would be identical regardless of any personal connections, then you're operating within appropriate ethical boundaries. And if the personal connections actually provide additional insight into leadership effectiveness and employee relations, then those insights are relevant data points, as long as they're considered within the broader context of comprehensive performance evaluation. That conversation helped clarify my approach for Monday's meeting. I wouldn't be seeking revenge or trying to manufacture negative outcomes. I would simply be conducting the kind of thorough, objective evaluation that every underperforming division deserved, and that Harold Grayson's employees had been requesting through their feedback surveys for months. The irony was that if Harold Grayson had been performing effectively, Monday's evaluation would only confirm his competence and strengthen his position within the company. The fact that I was anticipating a different outcome wasn't based on personal animosity. It was based on months of performance data that painted a clear picture of leadership challenges that needed to be addressed. As I prepared for bed Sunday night, I felt a sense of calm anticipation that I hadn't experienced in years. Not because I was planning to humiliate anyone, but because I was finally in a position to demonstrate the difference between superficial success and substantive achievement. Monday morning would bring clarity to questions that had been clouding my relationship with my father for decades. And whatever the outcome, it would be based on facts, performance data, and professional standards, rather than personal opinions or family dynamics. The truth, as they say, has a way of revealing itself when you create the right conditions for it to emerge. Monday morning arrived with the kind of precision that only comes from meticulous preparation. I was in my office by 6:30, reviewing final documents and ensuring that every aspect of the day's proceedings would reflect the professionalism and thoroughness that Blackstone Industries' board expected from their chairman. The executive boardroom on the 45th floor was prepared exactly as I'd requested, presentation materials arranged for each participant, performance data compiled into comprehensive portfolios, and the kind of quietly elegant atmosphere that facilitated serious business discussions. But what made this particular Monday different from every other board meeting I'd conducted was the knowledge that today's decisions would ripple through more than just corporate hierarchies. At 8:15, Rebecca knocked on my office door with the employee feedback forms that had been collected over the weekend. "Ms. Ashford, The 360-degree evaluations are complete. We received responses from 12 employees in Harold Grayson's division, including several very detailed comments about leadership effectiveness and communication practices. I accepted the sealed envelope containing the anonymous feedback, knowing that within those pages lay insights that would either confirm or contradict my father's glowing assessment of his boss's capabilities. Thank you, Rebecca. Please ensure that Harold Grayson receives his full evaluation packet 30 minutes before the meeting begins. I want him to have adequate time to review the performance data and prepare his responses. At exactly 9 o'clock, board members began arriving for what they believed would be a routine quarterly review. Directors filed into the boardroom with their usual mixture of confidence and caution, confident in the company's overall direction under my leadership, but cautious about the specific restructuring decisions that would shape our competitive future. Harold Grayson arrived at 9:20, looking exactly as my father had described him, well-dressed, professionally polished, and carrying himself with the kind of self-assurance that comes from years of middle management success. He was tall, probably in his early 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the sort of firm handshake that suggested he'd spent considerable time perfecting his executive presence. But as I watched him review his evaluation materials, I noticed subtle signs of nervousness that hadn't been apparent during our previous interactions. A slight tension in his shoulders, the way he kept adjusting his reading glasses, the careful attention he paid to documents that should have contained familiar information about his own division's performance. "Good morning, Harold," I said as he settled into his seat across from me. "I trust you've had a chance to review the evaluation framework for today's discussion?" "Yes, Madam Chairman, though I have to say, this level of detail is quite comprehensive. I wasn't expecting such an extensive analysis of individual employee feedback." There it was, the first indication that Harold Grayson might not be as connected to his team's experiences as his position required. Any effective leader should have anticipated that employee feedback would be central to a comprehensive performance evaluation. Employee satisfaction and engagement are critical metrics for sustainable success, I replied evenly, particularly in divisions that have experienced declining performance indicators over recent quarters. I watched as that observation landed. Grayson's confident expression shifted slightly, replaced by the kind of careful attention that comes when someone realizes they're in more serious territory than they'd anticipated. The meeting began with standard quarterly reports from other division heads, but I could sense that everyone in the room understood we were building toward Harold Grayson's evaluation. There was an undercurrent of tension that always accompanied discussions about underperforming departments, the recognition that careers and livelihoods hung in the balance of these conversations. When we reached Harold's segment of the agenda, I opened his performance portfolio and began with the most objective data available. "Harold, your division's client retention rate has declined by 22% over the past 18 months. Customer satisfaction scores have dropped 15% in the same period. Can you walk us through your analysis of these trends and the strategies you've implemented to address them?" The question was straightforward and completely appropriate for any executive evaluation, but as Harold began his response, it became clear that he'd been caught off guard by the specificity of the performance data. "Well, Madam Chairman, the market has been challenging for all regional operations. We've faced increased competition and some pricing pressures that have affected client relationships across the board." "That's certainly true," I acknowledged. "However, other regional divisions have maintained or improved their retention rates during the same period. What specific factors do you believe have contributed to your division's different trajectory?" I wasn't trying to trap him. I was providing an opportunity for him to demonstrate the kind of strategic analysis and self-awareness that effective leadership requires. But his answer revealed exactly the kind of thinking that had led to his division's struggles. "I think we may have been dealing with a particularly difficult client portfolio," he said, glancing around the room as if seeking support from other board members. "Some of these accounts were challenging from the beginning. That response told me everything I needed to know about Harold Grayson's leadership philosophy. Rather than taking responsibility for performance outcomes or demonstrating insight into improvement strategies, he was attributing problems to external factors and inherited difficulties. I opened the employee feedback envelope and selected one of the anonymous comments that directly addressed this pattern. "Harold, I'd like to share some feedback from your team members." One employee wrote, "Our department feels disconnected from strategic planning processes. When problems arise, there's often finger-pointing rather than collaborative problem-solving. We rarely receive actionable guidance for improving client relationships." The room fell silent. This wasn't personal criticism. It was professional feedback that highlighted fundamental leadership challenges that affected both employee morale and business outcomes. Another team member noted, "Mr. Grayson is pleasant to work with, but he doesn't seem to have a clear vision for where our division is headed. We often feel like we're reacting to problems rather than preventing them." Harold's face had flushed slightly, and I could see him struggling to formulate a response that would address these concerns without admitting to significant leadership gaps. "Madam Chairman, employee feedback can sometimes reflect misunderstandings about strategic priorities that aren't always visible at the operational level." That response was perhaps the most revealing of all. Instead of acknowledging the validity of his employees' concerns or demonstrating curiosity about how to improve communication and strategic clarity, he was essentially dismissing their perspectives as uninformed. I leaned forward slightly, maintaining the kind of professional demeanor that had carried me through countless difficult business conversations. "Harold, effective leadership requires the ability to translate strategic vision into actionable guidance that employees can understand and implement. If your team feels disconnected from strategic planning, that suggests an opportunity for improved communication and engagement. How do you plan to address these concerns?" What followed was 10 minutes of corporate speak that managed to say very little, while revealing everything about why Harold Grayson's division was struggling. He talked about enhanced communication protocols and strategic alignment initiatives, without demonstrating any real understanding of the fundamental leadership challenges his employees had identified. By the time his evaluation segment concluded, it was clear to everyone in the room that Harold Grayson was a competent operational manager who had been promoted into a strategic leadership role that exceeded his capabilities. His division's declining performance wasn't the result of market conditions or inherited problems. It was the natural consequence of leadership approaches that prioritized maintaining comfortable routines over driving meaningful improvement. "Thank you, Harold," I said as we moved toward the meeting's conclusion. "The board will review today's discussion along with the comprehensive performance data and provide you with specific feedback about next steps by Wednesday morning." As board members filed out of the conference room, I noticed Harold lingering near the presentation materials, studying the performance charts as if seeing them clearly for the first time. "Madam Chairman," he said as the room emptied, "I hope you understand that I'm committed to addressing any concerns that have been raised today." "I appreciate that, Harold. Commitment to improvement is exactly what we need from all our division leaders." But we both knew that commitment alone wouldn't be sufficient to address the fundamental leadership challenges that today's evaluation had revealed. Harold Grayson was about to discover that good intentions and professional polish couldn't compensate for the kind of strategic vision and employee engagement that modern business success required. And somewhere in the floors below us, my father was continuing his workday completely unaware that his boss had just experienced the most challenging performance evaluation of his career, conducted by the daughter he'd called a failure just 4 days earlier. By Tuesday afternoon, the ripple effects of Monday's board meeting had begun spreading through Blackstone Industries in ways that would have fascinated any student of organizational dynamics. What started as a routine performance evaluation had evolved into something far more significant, a catalyst for conversations, concerns, and strategic maneuvering that reached well beyond the executive floors. Harold Grayson had spent Monday evening and all of Tuesday morning in damage control mode, though he didn't yet understand the full scope of what he was trying to control. I knew this because Rebecca had been fielding unusual requests from his assistant all day. Requests for historical performance data, employee satisfaction surveys from previous years, and detailed breakdowns of client retention metrics that Harold apparently hadn't been tracking as closely as his position required. The first direct indication that Harold was feeling pressure came in the form of an email he sent Tuesday at 2:30, requesting an urgent meeting to, quote, discuss strategic alignment opportunities and performance enhancement initiatives. The language was classic corporate panic disguised as proactive leadership, the kind of response that executives use when they realize their job security might be in question. I agreed to meet with him Wednesday morning, which gave me Tuesday evening to review the complete evaluation data and prepare for what I suspected would be a much more revealing conversation than Monday's formal board presentation. But Harold Grayson wasn't the only person feeling pressure. Tuesday brought an unexpected phone call that added an entirely new dimension to the situation. A call from my father. I was reviewing quarterly projections in my office when Rebecca announced that Richard Thornfield was on line 2, requesting to speak with the chairman's office about urgent operational concerns. For a moment, I sat there staring at the blinking light on my phone, processing the surreal nature of what was happening. My father was calling my office, asking to speak with me in my professional capacity, completely unaware that he was about to have a conversation with the daughter he'd humiliated 4 days earlier. Put him through, Rebecca. Good afternoon, this is Victoria Ashford. Ms. Ashford, this is Richard Thornfield from Regional Operations. I hope you don't mind me calling directly, but I wanted to express some concerns about the evaluation process that's been affecting our division. His voice carried the same authoritative tone he'd used at Thanksgiving dinner when explaining how the real world worked. The irony was so thick I could practically taste it. Of course, Mr. Thornfield, what specific concerns did you want to discuss? Well, ma'am, I've been with this company for 8 years, and I've never seen Harold Grayson as rattled as he's been since Monday's meeting. He's asking questions about employee feedback and client satisfaction that suggest he might not have been getting accurate information from his management team. I leaned back in my chair, fascinated by this unfolding dynamic. My father was essentially calling to defend the man he'd held up as an example of everything I wasn't, while speaking to the daughter whose professional competence he'd publicly questioned just days earlier. Mr. Thornfield, can you be more specific about what you mean by accurate information? I think some of the employee feedback might have been influenced by people who don't understand the bigger picture of what we're trying to accomplish in this division. Harold Grayson is a good leader who's been dealing with some challenging circumstances that might not be obvious to people higher up in the organization. There it was, the same pattern of deflection and excuse-making that had characterized Harold's performance evaluation, now being reinforced by his own employees. My father was advocating for his boss using exactly the same logic that had led to the division's declining performance in the first place. That's interesting, Mr. Thornfield. From your perspective as someone who works directly with Mr. Grayson, how would you characterize his leadership style and strategic approach? He's practical, ma'am. He understands that you can't always chase perfect solutions when you're dealing with real-world constraints. Some of the criticism I've been hearing sounds like it's coming from people who don't have enough experience to understand how business actually works. I had to pause for a moment to appreciate the beautiful irony of what was happening. My father was explaining to me how business actually works, using the same condescending tone he'd employed at Thanksgiving dinner, while completely unaware that he was speaking to someone whose understanding of business had led to her being appointed chairman of his company. Mr. Thornfield, I appreciate your loyalty to your supervisor. Can you give me some specific examples of the practical leadership approaches that you think are being undervalued? Well, for instance, Harold knows that sometimes you have to accept that certain clients are just difficult, and it's not always productive to keep throwing resources at relationships that might not be salvageable. Some people think you can fix every problem with better communication or more strategic planning, but sometimes you just have to be realistic about what's possible. As he spoke, I realized I was getting a masterclass in exactly why Harold Grayson's division was failing, the leadership philosophy my father was defending, acceptance of difficult situations, resignation to inherited problems, skepticism about strategic improvement initiatives, was precisely the mindset that had led to declining client satisfaction and employee disengagement. That's a pragmatic perspective, Mr. Thornfield. How do you think Mr. Grayson's approach compares to the leadership strategies being implemented in other divisions that have maintained or improved their performance metrics? There was a pause, and I could sense him struggling with a question that challenged his fundamental assumptions about effective leadership. I wouldn't really know about other divisions, ma'am. I just know that Harold has been consistent and reliable, and I think some of the criticism he's receiving might be unfair. Mr. Thornfield, I want to assure you that all performance evaluations are based on objective data and comprehensive analysis. Mr. Grayson will have multiple opportunities to address any concerns and demonstrate his leadership capabilities moving forward. After I hung up, I sat in my office contemplating the psychological complexity of what had just occurred. My father had called to defend Harold Grayson's leadership, using arguments that inadvertently demonstrated exactly why that leadership was ineffective. He had spoken to me with the kind of paternal condescension usually reserved for explaining obvious truths to someone too inexperienced to understand them. And through it all, he had remained completely oblivious to the fact that he was speaking to the daughter whose business acumen he'd publicly questioned, and whose professional authority now extended over every aspect of his working life. But the most revealing aspect of the conversation wasn't the irony, it was the insight it provided into the cultural challenges that Harold Grayson's division was facing. If my father's perspective was representative of the broader employee mindset, then Harold wasn't just dealing with individual performance issues. He was dealing with a systemic culture that valued loyalty over results, consistency over innovation, and acceptance over improvement. That evening, I received another call that added yet another layer to the escalating situation. This time it was from Gerald Mitchell, the Senior Vice President of Human Resources, who had been monitoring employee communications related to Monday's evaluation. Victoria, I wanted to give you a heads up about some chatter that's been circulating in Harold Grayson's division. Apparently there's been speculation about whether the evaluation process was fair, and some employees are considering filing formal complaints about what they perceive as sudden changes in performance standards. Gerald, what specific concerns are being raised? The main issue seems to be that some long-term employees feel like they're being judged by criteria that weren't clearly communicated previously. There's also some concern that external consultants or new management philosophies are being imposed without adequate input from people who understand the operational realities. I recognized this pattern. It was the organizational equivalent of what happens when ineffective leadership is finally subjected to appropriate accountability measures. Employees who had grown comfortable with low standards often interpreted the introduction of proper evaluation criteria as unfair treatment rather than necessary improvement. Gerald, I want you to document all of these concerns and prepare a comprehensive response that explains our evaluation methodology and performance standards. Also, I think it would be valuable to schedule individual meetings with any employees who want to discuss their specific concerns about the process. Of course, Victoria, should I also prepare talking points for Harold Grayson so he can address these issues with his team? Let's see how Wednesday's meeting goes first. I want to understand Harold's perspective on these employee concerns before we develop any communication strategies. As I prepared to leave the office Tuesday evening, I realized that what had started as a simple performance evaluation was evolving into a comprehensive case study in organizational change management. Harold Grayson, my father, and their colleagues were responding to accountability measures with exactly the kind of resistance and rationalization that typically accompanies necessary but uncomfortable improvements. Wednesday's meeting would determine whether Harold possessed the leadership flexibility to adapt his approach, or whether the cultural challenges in his division required more dramatic intervention. Wednesday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability, Harold Grayson appeared in my office at exactly 9 o'clock, carrying a leather portfolio that appeared to contain every document he could possibly gather to support his case for continued employment. But what made this meeting different from every other executive conversation I'd conducted was the knowledge that within the next hour, the careful separation between my professional and personal worlds would finally, definitively, collapse. "Harold, please have a seat. I appreciate you taking the time to meet this morning." He settled into the chair across from my desk with the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing your career hangs in the balance. But there was something else in his demeanor, a subtle confidence that suggested he believed he had allies and arguments that would tip the scales in his favor. "Madam Chairman, I've spent the past 2 days conducting my own analysis of the concerns raised in Monday's evaluation, and I think there may be some context that wasn't fully considered in the initial assessment." "I'm listening." Harold opened his portfolio and began what was clearly a carefully rehearsed presentation. He had charts showing industry-wide performance declines, documentation of inherited client problems, and testimonials from several employees who praised his steady leadership during challenging times. "As you can see from these comparative analyses, the challenges my division has faced are consistent with broader market trends affecting regional operations across the industry. Additionally, I've received strong endorsements from several long-term employees who understand the complexities of our operational environment." He was building a case based on exactly the kind of thinking that had led to his division's problems, the assumption that external circumstances and employee loyalty were more important than measurable results and strategic leadership. "Harold, these are certainly relevant considerations. Can you walk me through your specific plans for addressing the client retention and employee engagement issues we discussed on Monday?" That question was the test. An effective leader would have used the past 2 days to develop concrete strategies for improvement. Harold's response would reveal whether he possessed the self-awareness and strategic thinking necessary to turn his division's performance around. "Well, Madam Chairman, I think the key is helping people understand that not every metric tells the complete story. Some of our client challenges stem from unrealistic expectations that were set before I took over the division. And regarding employee feedback, I believe some of the concerns reflect misunderstandings about strategic priorities that could be addressed through better communication." There it was, the same pattern of deflection and excuse-making that had characterized every interaction we'd had about his division's performance. Harold Grayson wasn't proposing solutions. He was proposing better explanations for why solutions weren't necessary. "Harold, I want to share something with you that might provide additional perspective on this situation." I leaned forward and pulled out the employee feedback forms that had been submitted as part of the evaluation process. But this time, I selected the responses that were signed rather than anonymous, including one that would change the trajectory of our conversation in ways Harold couldn't possibly anticipate. One of your employees wrote, "Mr. Grayson is a decent person who works hard, but he doesn't seem to have the kind of strategic vision that would help our division compete more effectively. When problems arise, there's often a tendency to explain why they're unavoidable rather than developing innovative approaches to solve them." Harold nodded, probably expecting me to continue with similar feedback. Instead, I placed the form on the desk where he could see the signature at the bottom. This particular assessment was submitted by Richard Thornfield, who I believe you mentioned has been one of your strongest supporters. The color drained from Harold's face as he read the signature. For a moment, he stared at the document as if it might transform into something different if he looked at it long enough. I don't understand. Richard called your office yesterday to express support for my leadership approach." Yes, he did. And during that conversation, he inadvertently confirmed many of the concerns raised in his written feedback. "Harold, there's something else you should know about that phone call." I paused, watching as Harold processed the implications of learning that his most vocal supporter had also submitted one of his most critical evaluations. "When Richard Thornfield called my office yesterday to defend your leadership, he was speaking to Victoria Ashford, chairman of Blackstone Industries. What he didn't realize was that he was also speaking to Victoria Thornfield, the daughter he spent Thanksgiving dinner calling a failure who couldn't hold down a real job. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in a professional setting. Harold sat perfectly still, his eyes moving between the employee feedback form and my face, as he tried to process the multiple layers of what I'd just revealed. You're Richard's daughter? I am. The same daughter he told you about at your company retreat. The one who supposedly doesn't understand how business really works, who's living in a fantasy world of corporate strategy, who represents everything that's wrong with young people who think they deserve success without earning it. Harold's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words emerged. I could see him mentally reviewing every conversation he'd had with my father, every casual comment about family disappointments, every casual dismissal of my supposed professional delusions. Harold, I want you to understand something very clearly. The evaluation of your division's performance has nothing to do with personal relationships or family dynamics. Every metric we discussed, every piece of employee feedback, every concern about strategic leadership, all of that is based on objective analysis of your division's results and effectiveness. He nodded slowly, still struggling to integrate this new information with everything he thought he understood about the situation. But what this revelation does illustrate is the danger of making assumptions about success, competence, and professional capability based on limited information or superficial indicators. Your employee, my father, spent Thanksgiving dinner explaining to a room full of people why I was a failure, while praising you as an example of real business success. Meanwhile, that same evening, I was reviewing performance data that clearly indicated your division was struggling significantly. I stood and walked to the window overlooking the city, giving Harold a moment to process what was happening. The irony, Harold, is that if your division had been performing effectively, this personal connection would be completely irrelevant. My father's opinion of my professional capabilities wouldn't change the fact that you were delivering results and leading your team successfully. But because your division has been underperforming, this situation has become a rather pointed lesson in the difference between perception and reality. When I turned back to face him, Harold had regained some of his composure, though his face was still pale. Madam Chairman, I had no idea about the family connection. Richard speaks about his daughters, but he never mentioned that one of them worked here, let alone that she was your boss's boss's boss. He nodded, and for the first time since I'd known him, Harold Grayson looked like someone who was beginning to understand the actual dynamics of the situation he'd been navigating. Harold, I'm going to be very direct with you. Your division's performance requires immediate and significant improvement. The employee feedback indicates fundamental leadership challenges that go beyond market conditions or inherited problems. And your response to these concerns suggests that you may not possess the strategic flexibility necessary to address them effectively. I returned to my desk and pulled out a document I'd prepared that morning. You have two options. Option 1. Accept a voluntary transition to a senior operational role that better matches your demonstrated capabilities, with a comprehensive severance package and positive references for external opportunities. Option 2. Continue in your current position with a 90-day performance improvement plan that includes specific, measurable targets for client retention, employee engagement, and strategic initiative implementation. Harold stared at the document, and I could see him weighing his options with the kind of clarity that comes when all illusions have been stripped away. If I choose the performance improvement plan and don't meet the targets, then your employment with Blackstone Industries will be terminated, and the circumstances of that termination will be documented in your personnel file. He was quiet for several minutes, studying the papers and presumably considering not just his own future, but the broader implications of what had just occurred. Madam Chairman, may I ask, what are you going to tell your father about this situation? I smiled, and for the first time since the conversation began, it was genuine rather than professional. Harold, I'm not going to tell my father anything. He's going to figure it out on his own when you either accept a new position or begin implementing dramatic changes to address your division's performance challenges. Either way, he's going to start asking questions about why his boss's situation changed so suddenly. And when he discovers the connection, then he's going to have a very interesting conversation with himself about the accuracy of his assessments regarding success, failure, and professional competence. Harold closed his portfolio and stood, his movements careful and deliberate. "Madam Chairman, I need some time to consider these options." "Of course. Please let me know your decision by Friday morning." As he reached the door, Harold turned back one final time. "For what it's worth, your father speaks about you with genuine affection, even when he's expressing frustration about your career choices. I think he loves you more than his words might suggest." I nodded, appreciating the gesture, even though it didn't change the fundamental dynamics we'd been discussing. "Harold, love and respect are different things. And respect requires acknowledging someone's actual capabilities, rather than dismissing them based on your own assumptions or limitations." After he left, I sat in my office contemplating the perfect symmetry of what had just occurred. The man my father had held up as an example of everything I wasn't had just learned that his own job security depended entirely on the professional competence of the daughter my father considered a failure. Monday morning would bring Harold's decision and the beginning of whatever came next. But regardless of what he chose, the careful separation between Victoria Ashford, the chairman, and Victoria Thornfield, the disappointing daughter, was now permanently dissolved. And my father was about to discover exactly who his daughter had become while he wasn't paying attention. Friday morning arrived with Harold Grayson's resignation letter on my desk and a phone call that would change the trajectory of my relationship with my family forever. Harold had chosen the voluntary transition, accepting a senior operational role in a different division along with the comprehensive severance package I'd offered. His letter was professionally written and gracious, acknowledging that his leadership style was better suited to operational management than strategic division oversight. But more importantly, it demonstrated the kind of self-awareness that had been missing from our previous conversations. I realize now that effective leadership requires the ability to adapt to changing performance standards and strategic requirements, he'd written. While I'm disappointed that my tenure in regional management didn't meet expectations, I'm grateful for the opportunity to contribute to Blackstone Industries in a capacity that better matches my demonstrated strengths. It was exactly the kind of mature professional response that would allow him to maintain his dignity while addressing the performance issues that had made his position untenable. Harold Grayson would remain with the company, my father would keep his job, and the division would get the strategic leadership it needed to improve its performance metrics. But Harold's resignation was just the beginning of what Friday would bring. At 10:30, Rebecca announced that Richard Thornfield was on line 2, requesting to speak with me about, quote, urgent developments affecting departmental morale. I knew immediately that my father had learned about Harold's transition and was calling to express concerns about the organizational changes he didn't yet understand. "This is Victoria Ashford. Ms. Ashford, this is Richard Thornfield again. I'm calling because Harold Grayson submitted his resignation from divisional management yesterday, and there's a lot of confusion about what this means for our department's future stability." His voice carried the same authoritative tone he'd used in our previous conversation, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty that suggested he was beginning to question his understanding of the situation. "Mr. Thornfield, I can assure you that Mr. Grayson's transition was handled professionally and will actually strengthen the division's strategic capabilities moving forward. Ma'am, with all due respect, Harold Grayson was one of the most competent managers this company has ever had. If someone with his experience and track record is being forced out, it suggests that maybe the evaluation standards being applied aren't realistic for the actual business environment we're operating in." I leaned back in my chair, marveling at the consistency of my father's perspective, even as evidence mounted that his assessments were fundamentally flawed. "Mr. Thornfield, what specific aspects of Mr. Grayson's leadership do you believe weren't adequately recognized in the evaluation process? His stability, his loyalty to his employees, his understanding that you can't fix every problem with fancy strategic theories. Harold knew how to work within real-world constraints instead of chasing perfect solutions that don't exist in actual business operations." There it was again, the same philosophy that had characterized Harold's underperformance, now being defended by my father as evidence of superior leadership understanding. Mr. Thornfield, I appreciate your loyalty to your former supervisor, but I'm curious about something. In your experience, what does successful business leadership actually look like? What qualities should someone in my position value when evaluating executive performance? The question seemed to catch him off guard, and there was a long pause before he responded. Well, ma'am, I think the most important thing is practical experience and the wisdom that comes from understanding how things really work in the field. Too many young executives these days think they can revolutionize everything with theories they learned in business school, but they don't have the real-world experience to know what's actually possible. I felt a familiar stirring of the frustration that had characterized our relationship for decades, but this time it was tempered by something new, a kind of detached curiosity about how long it would take him to recognize the fundamental contradictions in his perspective. That's an interesting point, Mr. Thornfield. Can you give me some examples of the kind of real-world experience that you think provides better business insight than formal strategic training? Years of working directly with clients, understanding operational challenges that don't show up in quarterly reports, knowing how to maintain team morale during difficult periods. The kind of knowledge you only get from being in the trenches, not from sitting in boardrooms making decisions about situations you've never actually dealt with personally. As he spoke, I realized that my father was essentially arguing that experience in subordinate positions provided better business insight than demonstrated success in leadership roles. He was defending a worldview where seniority trumped results, loyalty outweighed effectiveness, and comfort with existing problems was more valuable than the ability to solve them. Mr. Thornfield, I want to ask you something that might seem unusual, but I think it's relevant to this conversation. Do you have children? The question clearly surprised him. Yes, ma'am, 2 daughters. And in your experience as a father, how do you balance supporting your children's confidence with providing realistic guidance about their capabilities and potential? There was another long pause, and I could sense him wondering why the chairman of Blackstone Industries was asking about his parenting philosophy. I try to be honest with them about their strengths and weaknesses. I don't want them to have unrealistic expectations that would set them up for disappointment later in life. That's thoughtful. And how do you determine whether their expectations are unrealistic? What criteria do you use to assess their actual capabilities? Well, I look at their track record, their practical experience, whether they've demonstrated the kind of sustained success that indicates they're ready for more responsibility. I smiled, recognizing the perfect setup for what would come next. Mr. Thornfield, that's excellent parenting wisdom. Now, applying that same logic to business evaluation, if someone had a track record of sustained success, demonstrated practical experience, and proven capability in handling significant responsibility, would you say that person had earned the right to make strategic decisions about organizational direction? Absolutely. That's exactly the kind of person who should be in leadership positions. I'm glad we agree on that principle, Mr. Thornfield, because it's going to make the next part of our conversation much easier. I paused, giving him a moment to wonder what I meant by that comment. Mr. Thornfield, I need to tell you something that I think will provide important context for your concerns about organizational changes. My full name is Victoria Elena Ashford, but until I was 25 years old, my name was Victoria Elena Thornfield. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the air conditioning cycling in my office. I'm your daughter, Dad. The one you called a failure at Thanksgiving dinner. The one whose career you've been dismissing for the past decade. The one you told Harold Grayson represented everything that's wrong with young people, who think they deserve success without earning it. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. Victoria? Yes, Dad. The daughter who apparently doesn't understand how business really works is the person who's been making strategic decisions about Harold Grayson's future and every other aspect of this company's operations. I could hear him breathing, but no words came for what felt like several minutes. Dad, Are you still there? I don't understand. You said you worked in corporate strategy. You never said, I work in corporate strategy because I'm the chairman of Blackstone Industries. I've been in this position for over a year. The fantasy world you've been criticizing is actually a corner office on the 45th floor of the Meridian Tower, where I make decisions that affect thousands of employees and millions of dollars in corporate assets. Another long silence then, but you never told us. Dad, I tried to tell you at Thanksgiving dinner. I brought articles about my work, recognition from business publications, documentation of everything I'd achieved. And instead of asking about my career with genuine interest, you spent 20 minutes explaining to everyone at the table why I was a disappointment who couldn't hold down a real job. I could hear him struggling to process not just the revelation, but the implications of every conversation we'd had over the past decade. The Forbes article, the Wall Street Journal feature, the Harvard Business Review case study, all of that was about me, Dad. While you were telling people I was a failure, I was being recognized as one of the most innovative business leaders in the region. Victoria, I had no idea. I know you didn't, and that's exactly the problem. You spent 32 years making assumptions about my capabilities based on your own limitations, rather than on any actual evidence of what I was accomplishing. When he spoke again, his voice had changed completely, the authoritative tone replaced by something much more vulnerable. What does this mean for my job? For my future with the company? Dad, your job was never in danger. Harold's transition was based on his division's performance, not on any personal considerations. You'll continue working for Blackstone Industries under new divisional leadership, and if you're committed to professional growth, you'll probably find the changes beneficial. And for us? For our family? I looked out the window at the city skyline, contemplating a question that had no easy answers. Dad, I love you. I've always loved you, and I always will. But I can't continue pretending that your approval matters more than my own self-respect. I've spent 32 years trying to earn recognition from someone who was apparently incapable of seeing my actual achievements. Victoria, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I know you are, Dad, and I accept your apology. But apologies don't erase decades of psychological conditioning. I've learned to value my own judgment over your assessments. And that's not going to change just because you've finally discovered who I really am. We talked for another 20 minutes about my career, about his assumptions, about the possibility of building a different kind of relationship based on mutual respect rather than his approval and my desperate need for it. When we hung up, I sat in my office feeling something I'd never experienced before, complete peace with who I was, regardless of what anyone else thought about it. Monday brought new challenges, new opportunities, and the beginning of a corporate restructuring initiative that would position Blackstone Industries for sustained competitive success. But more importantly, it brought the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one where Victoria Ashford, the chairman, and Victoria Thornfield, the daughter, were finally the same person. My father calls me now, sometimes. We have dinner occasionally. He asks about my work with genuine curiosity rather than predetermined judgment. It's not the relationship I dreamed of as a child, but it's honest, respectful, and based on who we actually are, rather than who we wished each other might become. And every Thanksgiving, I'm grateful for the lesson that sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up teaching us the most valuable truths about our own strength. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.